Before Rome was an empire, before Greece had philosophers, before the Bible was written, there was Syria, a land so ancient that human beings have lived here for over 1 million years, a land where the world's first alphabet was born, where the first great empires rose and collapsed, where Christianity spread across the earth, where one of the most powerful caliphates in history chose to plant its throne. And today, a country in ruins, a people scattered across the world, a story that the news can barely explain in 2 minutes. But we have 50. This is the entire history of Syria, from the Stone Age to the fall of Assad, from paradise to catastrophe, and everything in between. The cradled prehistoric Syria, 1 million BC to 10,000 BC. Long before Syria had a name, it had people. Archaeological evidence shows that hominids walked this land over 1 million years ago. The region sits at one of the most strategically vital crossroads on Earth, where Africa, Europe, and Asia converge, and that geography made it a magnet for human migration since the very beginning. The land we now call Syria is part of what historians call the Fertile Crescent, a sweeping arc of rich, well-watered land stretching from modern Iraq through Syria and down into Israel and Egypt. This was the nursery of civilization, the place where wild grasses became wheat, where wolves became dogs, where wandering became settling. Around 10,000 BC, something extraordinary began to happen in northern Syria, near a region called the Euphrates Valley. Humans stopped moving. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors had followed herds, chased seasons, and slept under open skies. But here, in the shadow of the Syrian mountains, small communities began to build first simple shelters, then permanent homes. This was the Neolithic Revolution, and Syria was one of its epicenters. The site of Tel Abu Harera, discovered beneath what is now a reservoir in northern Syria, shows evidence of one of the earliest farming communities ever found, dating back nearly 12,000 years. People here cultivated rye, then wheat and barley. They kept animals. They stayed. Civilization had begun. The first cities, Bronze Age Syria, 4000 BC to 1200 BC by 4000 BC. The small farming villages of Syria had grown into something the world had never seen before. Cities, not camps, not seasonal settlements. Cities with streets, temples, palaces, trade networks, and tens of thousands of inhabitants. The greatest of these was Ebla. Located in northwestern Syria near modern Idlib, Ebla was a metropolis. At its height around 2400 BC, it may have housed 250,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth at the time. Italakin, a royal court, and an elaborate bureaucratic system that kept records of everything. Trade deals, legal contracts, tribute payments, diplomatic letters, and how do we know this? Because in 1974, Italian archaeologists excavating the site of Tel Mardik discovered something remarkable, a royal archive of over 17,000 clay tablets, preserved for over 4,000 years beneath the rubble of a destroyed palace. These tablets, written in one of the earliest known writing systems, cuneiform, revealed that Ebla traded with cities as far as Mesopotamia and Egypt. They listed the names of gods, the prices of goods, the names of kings. Syria was not the periphery of the ancient world. It was the ancient world. But power in the Bronze Age was never stable for long. Ebla was conquered and burned, possibly by the Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great around 2300 BC. It was rebuilt, then burned again by the pharaoh Pepi, the first of Egypt. It recovered once more. Then, around 1600 BC, it was destroyed completely by the Hittites and never rose again. This was the rhythm of ancient Syria. Rise, burn, rebuild, rise again. Meanwhile, in the Euphrates Valley, another great city was growing, Mari. And along the coast, a civilization of seafarers was emerging that would change the world forever. The alphabet Ugarit and the Phoenicians 1400 BC to 700 BC on the coast of northern Syria, perched on a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, stood the city of It was a trading hub, a place where merchants from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Cyprus, and the Aegean met to do business. Ugarit was cosmopolitan, multilingual, and extraordinarily wealthy. and it gave humanity one of its greatest gifts. Around 1400 BC, scribes in Ugarit developed one of the world's first alphabets, a system of symbols representing sounds, rather than whole words or syllables. Before this, writing systems like Egyptian hieroglyphics required hundreds of symbols. Ugarit's alphabet had just 30 signs. Simple, learnable, revolutionary. This Ugaritic alphabet directly influenced the Phoenician alphabet, which spread across the Mediterranean and became the foundation of Greek, then Latin, then virtually every alphabet used in the Western world today, including the letters you're reading right now. The next time you write your name, you are using a system that began in Syria over 3,400 years ago. But Ugarit's story ends in mystery and catastrophe. Around 1185 BC, the city was destroyed suddenly, burned to the ground in what appears to have been a catastrophic raid. The last known tablet from Ugarit is a desperate letter to a neighboring king, warning of enemy ships approaching from the sea. No reply was ever sent. Ugarit was abandoned and never rebuilt. Its ruins lay hidden beneath a mound on the Syrian coast until a farmer's plow struck ancient masonry in 1928. Empires Koyide Syrians, Babylonians, and Persians 900 BC. 330 BC. After the Bronze Age collapse, Syria became a prize that every rising empire wanted. First came the Assyrians, perhaps the most feared military machine of the ancient world. Based in northern Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, the Assyrian Empire expanded westward with brutal efficiency. By the 800s BC, they controlled most of Syria. Their kings boasted of their conquests and graphic inscriptions, cities burned, populations deported, kings skinned alive. The Assyrians didn't just conquer Syria, they transformed it, building roads, standardizing weights and measures, creating administrative systems that would influence the region for centuries. But all empires fall. In 612 BC, the Assyrian capital of Nineveh was sacked by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. The empire that had terrorized the ancient world for centuries collapsed almost overnight. Syria then passed to the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II, the king who would famously destroy Jerusalem and carry the Jews into captivity. Then, in 539 BC, the Babylonians themselves fell to the greatest empire the world had yet seen, Persia. Under Cyrus the Great and his successors, Syria became a province, a satrapy of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which stretched from Greece to India. Persian rule brought relative stability. Taxes flowed to Persepolis. Local cultures were generally tolerated. Syria was now part of the world's first truly global empire. But something even bigger was coming from the west. A Greek fired Alexander and the Hellenistic era, 333 VC, 64 VC. In 333 BC, a young Macedonian king crossed into Syria with an army that had already shattered everything in its path. Alexander the Great had just defeated the Persian king III at the Battle of Issus, one of the most decisive battles in ancient history. Fought on the border between modern Turkey and Syria, the Persian army fled. Syria lay open. Alexander moved swiftly down the coast. Most cities surrendered without a fight, but one city refused. Tyre, on the Phoenician coast, held out for 7 months. Alexander responded by building a kilometer-long causeway into the sea to reach the island city, one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world, then besieged it until it fell. Syria was now Greek. When Alexander died in 323 BC without an heir, his generals, the Diadochi, or successors, tore his empire apart in decades of brutal war. Syria ultimately fell to Seleucus I, who founded the Seleucid Empire and established his capital at Antioch on the Orontes River in northern Syria. Antioch grew into one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 people, filled with Greek-style temples, theaters, bathhouses, and wide colonnaded streets. It was the third largest city in the Roman world, after Rome and Alexandria. Under Seleucid rule, Syria was Hellenized Greek language, Greek culture, Greek gods layered over ancient Syrian traditions. But the local people didn't disappear. They absorbed the Greek world and made it their own. This cultural blending Greco-Syrian civilization produced extraordinary art, philosophy, and scholarship that would influence the entire ancient world. But the Seleucids gradually weakened. Rome was rising in the west. The Parthians pressed from the east, and Syria, as always, was caught in the middle. Under the eagle, Roman Syria 64 BC, 636 AD, 64 BC, the Roman general Pompey the Great arrived in Syria and simply took it. The Seleucid king Antiochus XIII was deposed. Syria became a Roman province, and for the next 7 centuries it would remain one of the most important territories in the Roman world. This was not a conquest of destruction. Syria under Rome flourished. The Romans built roads that connected Syria to every corner of the empire. They built aqueducts that brought water to desert cities. They built Palmyra, the magnificent desert metropolis, whose colonnaded streets still owe visitors today, into one of the empire's great commercial hubs. Located on the trade routes between Rome and Persia, Palmyra grew fabulously wealthy as a middleman in the silk and spice trade. Its citizens built grand temples, elaborate tombs, and a culture that blended Roman, Greek, and Arab traditions into something entirely unique. And then, in the 260s AD, Palmyra produced one of the most extraordinary figures in ancient history, Queen Zenobia. When Roman Emperor Aurelian was distracted by crises elsewhere, Zenobia's generals seized Egypt. Then she declared herself Empress of the East and moved to conquer Asia Minor. For a brief, dazzling moment, Palmyra controlled nearly a third of the Roman Empire. Aurelian came back. He crushed her armies in 2 battles. He destroyed Palmyra. He brought Zenobia to Rome in golden chains, though according to some accounts, she ultimately lived in comfort in a Roman villa and died an old woman. Palmyra never recovered. Its ruins stand in the Syrian desert today as a monument to one woman's extraordinary ambition. Meanwhile, another revolution was reshaping Syria from within. Christianity was spreading. Syria was deeply intertwined with the origins of Christianity. The road to Damascus was where Paul of Tarsus had his famous conversion. Antioch was where followers of Jesus were first called Christians. Syrian theologians, monks, and scholars shaped early Christian doctrine in ways that reverberate through churches worldwide today. By the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity across the Roman Empire, Syria was already a deeply Christian land. But empires exhaust themselves. Rome split into East and West. The western half collapsed. Syria remained under the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, for 3 more centuries. Byzantine Syria was prosperous, but increasingly torn by religious controversy. The empire insisted on one version of Christian doctrine. Many Syrians followed different theological traditions, particularly Miaphysitism, and were persecuted for it. By the 630s, Syria was exhausted. Decades of devastating war between Byzantium and Persia had ravaged the land. People were poor, tired, and alienated from their distant rulers in Constantinople. Into this exhaustion rode something entirely new. The Crescent-Rizza's Islamic conquest, 636-661 AD. In 622 AD, a merchant from Mecca named Muhammad began preaching a new faith in Arabia. Within a decade, he had unified the Arab tribes under Islam. When Muhammad died in 632 AD, his successors launched a military expansion that would become one of the most stunning conquests in human history. The Arab armies moved with extraordinary speed. In 636 AD, at the Battle of Yarmouk, fought in a river valley on what is today the border between Syria and Jordan. A Byzantine army was destroyed by the Arab forces of Khalifa. It was one of the most decisive battles in world history. Syria fell almost immediately. City after city surrendered or was taken. Damascus, the ancient Syrian capital, opened its gates in 634 AD. What happened next surprised many Syrians. The Arab conquerors did not destroy. In many ways, the conquest was less traumatic than centuries of war and religious persecution under Byzantium had been. The new Muslim rulers generally allowed Christians and Jews to practice their religions in exchange for a special tax. Many Syrians, worn down by Byzantine theological coercion, converted willingly to Islam over the following generations. Syria had a new ruler, a new religion, and was about to become the center of the world. The Golden Throne, the Umayyad Caliphate, 661-750 AD. In 661, A Syrian governor named Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan did something unprecedented. He seized the caliphate, the leadership of the entire Islamic world, and moved its capital from Medina in Arabia to Damascus. Syria was no longer a province, it was the heart of the Islamic world. The Umayyad Caliphate that Muawiyah founded would rule an empire stretching from Spain to the borders of China, the largest empire the world had ever seen to that point, and Damascus was its throne. The Umayyads they commissioned the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, one of the most beautiful buildings in existence. They built the Great Mosque of Damascus, the Umayyad Mosque, converting a Roman temple and Byzantine cathedral into an Islamic masterpiece whose stunning green and gold mosaics still take the breath away today. Under the Umayyads, Arabic became the official language of government across the empire. Arabic script spread from Spain to Central Asia. The foundations of Islamic art, architecture, law, and scholarship were laid. Damascus in the early 700s was one of the most sophisticated cities on earth. Its markets sold silk from China, gold from Sudan, spices from India. Its scholars translated Greek philosophy into Arabic, preserving works that Europe had lost. But the Umayyads faced a fatal flaw: legitimacy. Many Muslims, particularly in Iraq and Persia, believed that leadership of the Islamic world should belong to the family of the Prophet Muhammad, not the Umayyad dynasty. The execution of Hussein ibn Ali, grandson of Muhammad, at the Battle of Karbala in 680 AD, became a founding trauma of Shia Islam and a wound that never healed. In 750 AD, a revolution swept the empire. The Abbasids, claiming descent from Muhammad's uncle, overthrew the Umayyads in a bloody coup, massacring most of the Umayyad family. They moved the capital east to the newly built city of Baghdad. Damascus was no longer the center of the world. Syria slipped into the role of a wealthy but secondary province, important but no longer the throne. Crusaders and swords. The Crusades in Saladin 109-61-291 and in 1095 AD, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in France and called on Christians to march east and take Jerusalem back from Muslim rulers. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of Europeans, knights, peasants, priests, adventurers, embarked on what became known as the Crusades, and Syria was directly in their path. In 1098, the Crusaders besieged and captured Antioch after a brutal 8-month siege. In 1099, Jerusalem fell. The Crusaders established a network of Latin Christian states across the Levant, including the Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli, both carved out of Syrian territory. For nearly 2 centuries, Syria was a battlefield between Christian Crusader states and Muslim powers. Then came Saladin, born in 1137 in Tikrit, modern Iraq, to a Kurdish family. Salah ed-Din Yusuf ibn Uyab, known to history as Saladin, was a military genius and political mastermind who reunified the Muslim world. He built his power base in Egypt, then moved into Syria, taking control of Damascus. From there, he unified Egypt and Syria into a single sultanate. And then he turned on the Crusaders. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin in Galilee, Saladin destroyed the main Crusader army by cutting off their water supply and surrounding them in the desert heat. Jerusalem fell soon after. Saladin's reputation in the Muslim world is enormous, but what surprised the Crusaders was his chivalry. Unlike the First Crusade, which ended in a massacre of Jerusalem's Muslims and Jews, Saladin allowed the Christian population to leave safely and ransomed many of the poor. The Crusades continued for another century, but the tide had turned. By 1291, the last Crusader city in the Holy Land, Acre, had fallen. The Crusaders' states were gone. Syria exhaled, but new storms were already forming on the horizon. Storms that would make the Crusades look like a minor disturbance. The Mongol Nightmare 1258-1300 AD, the Mongol armies of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, did something no enemy had achieved in 5 centuries. They sacked Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph was executed, reportedly rolled in a carpet, and trampled by horses, so that royal blood would not touch the earth. Hundreds of thousands died. The greatest library in the world was burned. The Tigris River ran black with ink from destroyed books. Then the Mongols turned toward Syria. Aleppo fell in 1260, sacked and burned. Damascus surrendered days later, but the Mongol advance was stopped dramatically and unexpectedly at the Battle of Ankh in Palestine in 1260, where the Egyptian Mamluk army defeated a Mongol force for the first time in history. The Mongols retreated from Syria, but they came back, raiding and burning multiple times over the following decades. The Syrian economy was devastated. Cities that had been among the greatest in the world were reduced to shadows of their former selves. Eventually, the Mongol Khans converted to Islam and were absorbed into the surrounding cultures, but the trauma they left behind shaped Syria for generations. Centuries under the Crescent. The Ottoman Empire 15161918. In 1516, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I led his army south from Anatolia and defeated the Egyptian Mamluk Sultanate at the Battle of Marj Dabik, just north of Aleppo. Syria became part of the Ottoman Empire and would remain so for over 400 years. Ottoman rule was, in many ways, stable and organized. Syria was divided into provinces administered by Ottoman governors. Damascus became a major hub of Islamic scholarship and pilgrimage, the starting point of the annual Hajj caravan to Mecca, which the Ottomans organized with great ceremony and expenditure. Aleppo flourished as a commercial capital, one of the most important trading cities in the eastern Mediterranean, where European merchants, Ottoman traders, and Asian caravans all converged. But Ottoman Syria was not without tensions. The empire was ruled from distant Istanbul, local Arab populations, while Muslim, like their rulers, spoke Arabic and had their own distinct culture and traditions. Power was often exercised through local strongmen and religious scholars. By the 19th century, the empire was in decay. It was Khajd, the sick man of Europe, struggling against European imperial expansion, internal rebellions, and economic stagnation. And in the Arab world, a new idea was taking hold. Arab nationalism, the belief that Arab peoples, united by language and culture, deserved their own independent states. Then came the catastrophe that would reshape the entire modern Middle East. The Great Betrayal, World War I, and the birth of modern Syria, 191–41946. When World War I began, the Ottoman Empire allied with Germany. Britain, France, and Russia allied against them. Britain needed Arab support to fight the Ottomans from within, so they made a promise. In 1915 to 1916, British High Commissioner Henry McMahon exchanged letters with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the guardian of Islam's holiest sites. Britain, McMahon implied, would support the creation of an independent Arab state after the war encompassing Syria, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabs rose in revolt. Lawrence of Arabia rode with them. They fought bravely against the Ottomans, dreaming of independence. They were betrayed. At the same moment as the McMahon letters, British diplomat Mark Sykes and his French counterpart, François Jaurès-Picot, were secretly drawing lines on a map of the Middle East, dividing the Arab world between Britain and France. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 allocated Syria and Lebanon to France, Iraq and Palestine to Britain. When the war ended in 1918 and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, France claimed Syria. Arab leaders who had been promised independence were swept aside. The Syrian Arab Congress declared Faisallah king of Syria in 1920, a desperate attempt to establish a fait accompli. France responded by sending the military. At the Battle of Massaloun, the small Syrian Arab army was crushed by French forces in a single afternoon. Syria was a French mandate, a colonial possession in everything but name. The French years were marked by resistance, uprisings, and repression. The most significant was the Great Syrian Revolt of 1925, a nationwide uprising against French rule that required France to bomb Damascus from the air to suppress. France carved Syria into multiple statelets, trying to divide ethnic and religious communities to prevent unified resistance. They detached Lebanon as a separate entity. They created the Alawite state in the northwest and the Jebel Druze state in the south. The wounds of this division never fully healed. Finally, in 1946, after years of nationalist pressure and the upheaval of World War II, France withdrew and Syria became an independent republic. But independence brought its own chaos. The republic and its coup Syria, 1946 to 1970. Independent Syria's early years were turbulent to the point of farce and then tragedy. Between 1946 and 1963, Syria experienced no fewer than 21 changes of government, including multiple military coups. Colonels replaced presidents, political parties rose and collapsed. The country was politically fragmented along lines of ethnicity, sect, region, and ideology. The Arab defeat in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, which Syria participated in, was a massive psychological blow that discredited the civilian government and accelerated military intervention in politics. In 1958, Syrian leaders, desperate for stability, agreed to merge with Egypt under President Nasser, forming the United Arab Republic. It was a remarkable experiment in Arab unity, and it lasted exactly 3 years. In 1961, a Syrian military coup broke the union apart. Egypt and Syria went their separate ways. In 1963, the Ba'ath Party, a pan-Arab socialist movement, seized power in a coup and never let go. The Ba'ath Renaissance Party believed in Arab unity, secularism, and socialism. It promised to transform Syria into a modern state that could take its rightful place in the Arab world. What it delivered, instead, was an authoritarian state that would steadily concentrate power in fewer and fewer hands. A series of internal purges and coups within the Ba'ath Party itself followed. Military officers outmaneuvered civilians. Regional and sectarian factions maneuvered against each other, and from this brutal competition, one man emerged victorious. Helaine of Damascus, Hafez al-Assad, 1970-2000 in November 1970, General Hafez al-Assad, the Syrian Minister of Defense, launched what he called the corrective movement, a bloodless coup that removed the existing Ba'ath leadership and made him the absolute ruler of Syria. He would hold that power for 30 years. Hafez al-Assad was an Alawite, a member of a minority religious sect, an offshoot of Shia Islam, that made up roughly 12% of Syria's population, mostly in the coastal mountains. Under the Ottomans and the French, Alawites had been among the most marginalized people in Syria. Assad used the Ba'ath Party and the military, where Alawites were disproportionately represented, to build a system of power that was both ruthless and sophisticated. He was the state was him. His secret police, the Mukhabarat, were everywhere. Syrians learned not to speak their minds. Dissent was crushed with terrifying efficiency. In 1982, the Muslim Brotherhood launched an armed uprising in the city of Hama. Assad's response was total. The Syrian armies surrounded the city and bombarded it for 27 days. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. The death toll is estimated between 10,000 and 40,000 people. The massacre of Hama was a message to all of Syria. This is what resistance costs. But Assad was not just a brute, he was a shrewd geopolitical operator. He fought Israel in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, partially recovering the Golan Heights before Israeli forces pushed back. He intervened in Lebanon, where Syria would maintain a suffocating presence for nearly 3 decades. He allied with Iran after its Islamic Revolution, an alliance that would shape the Middle East for generations. Assad positioned Syria as a leader of Arab resistance against Israel and American influence, giving his rule a nationalist legitimacy beyond mere repression. The Syrian economy, meanwhile, was heavily state-controlled, corrupt, and inefficient, propped up by oil revenues that were already declining by the 1990s when Hafez al-Assad died of a heart attack in June 2000. Power passed immediately to his son, the son Bashar al-Assad, and the road to Revolution 2002-011. Bashar al-Assad had not been groomed for power. He was an ophthalmologist, an eye doctor, trained in London, Western educated, married to a British Syrian woman named Asma who wore designer clothes and gave interviews to Vogue. When his brother Basil, the chosen heir, died in a car crash in 1994, Bashar was suddenly recalled from his medical career to be prepared for leadership. He inherited Syria in 2000 at age 34. At first, many Syrians and Western observers were cautiously optimistic. Bashar seemed different. He opened the internet. He allowed limited political discussion. A brief flowering of civil society emerged, the Damascus Spring, in which intellectuals gathered in private homes to discuss political reform. It lasted less than a year. The regime cracked down. The dissidents went to prison. Bashar al-Assad was his father's son, but the world had changed, and Syria was changing too. By the late 2000s, Syria was suffering a devastating drought, one of the worst in recorded history, linked to climate change. Hundreds of thousands of farmers abandoned the land and flooded into cities already struggling with unemployment and poverty. The economy was stagnant. Corruption was rampant. Young Syrians were increasingly connected through social media to a wider world, and increasingly frustrated with a regime that offered no future. And then, in December 2010, a Tunisian street vendor named Mohamed Bougizi set himself on fire to protest police harassment. The Arab Spring had begun. The fire? Syrian Civil War? 201-120-20. In March 2011, teenagers in the southern Syrian city of Deraa spray-painted anti-government slogans on a school wall, inspired by the uprisings spreading across the Arab world. The regime arrested them and, by multiple accounts, tortured them. When protesters took to the streets to demand their release, security forces opened fire. What happened next shook the world. Protests spread to cities across Syria: Damascus, Homs, Hama, Aleppo, Deir, Issour. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians, from all walks of life, took to the streets demanding reform, then dignity, then the fall of the regime. Assad's response was the response his father had given Hama in 1982. Forced Syrian security forces fired on crowds. Tanks rolled into neighborhoods. Mass arrests began. But this time the world was watching on YouTube, on Twitter, on Al Jazeera, and this time the protesters did not back down. By the summer of 2011, armed defections from the Syrian military were forming the Free Syrian Army. The protest movement was becoming a civil war. And then, as Syria always had throughout its ancient history, it became a battlefield for larger powers. The Assad regime was supported by Russia, which used its Security Council veto to block international intervention and sent weapons and advisors. Iran sent money, weapons, and the Lebanese militia Hezbollah to fight on Assad's behalf. The opposition was supported by Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United States, but never coherently, and with always competing agendas. Then, from the chaos, emerged the most feared force in the world. ISIS, the Islamic State, seized territory across eastern Syria and Iraq, declaring a caliphate in 2014, enslaving the Yazidi people, executing prisoners on video, destroying ancient archaeological sites, including, heartbreakingly, Palmyra, dynamiting the ancient temples that had survived 2,000 years. The war became a catastrophe beyond description. Chemical weapons were used, sarin gas attacks that killed hundreds of civilians, including children, in the suburbs of Damascus. The international community drew red lines and did nothing. Barrel bombs, crude containers filled with explosives and shrapnel, dropped from helicopters onto civilian neighborhoods, became a signature weapon of the Assad regime, killing thousands. By 2015, the regime was losing ground. Then Russia intervened directly with airstrikes, bombing not only ISIS, but rebel-held areas across the country, turning the military tide. The siege of Aleppo, Syria's second city, once one of the great cities of the world, lasted years. In December 2016, government forces retook the eastern half of the city. The images of civilians being evacuated under bombardment, of dust-covered children in ambulances, circled the world. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Over 500,000 people killed. More than 5 million refugees fled to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Europe. 6 million internally displaced within Syria. An estimated half the country's pre-war population was forced from their homes. Syria, one of the oldest inhabited places on Earth, had become the world's greatest humanitarian catastrophe. The fall of Assad, December 2024, by the early 2020s, the war had reached a grim stalemate. Assad controlled most of the country's major cities. The northwest, around Idlib, remained under control of various opposition groups. The northeast was held by Kurdish forces backed by the U.S. In the east, small ISIS cells continued their guerrilla campaign. Syria was broken but frozen, no peace, no resolution, no reconstruction, no future. Then came the earthquake. Not metaphorically, literally. In February 2023, a catastrophic earthquake struck southern Turkey and northern Syria, killing over 50,000 people, tens of thousands of them Syrians already displaced by the war. The international response to Assad Syria was muted. Even in disaster, the regime's isolation meant its people suffered more than they should have. But the earthquake was not the end. The end came differently. In late 2024, a coalition of opposition forces, led by the Islamist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham (TS) and allied factions, launched a stunning military offensive from Idlib. Within days, they had seized Aleppo, then Hama, then Homs. The Syrian army, demoralized, underpaid, and hollowed out by years of corruption and war, barely resisted. On December 8, 2024, opposition forces entered Damascus. Bashar al-Assad and his family fled Syria, reportedly to Russia, which gave him asylum. The Assad dynasty, which had ruled Syria with an iron fist for 54 years, was over. The Syrian people took to the streets, not in protest, but in celebration. They tore down portraits of Assad. They filmed themselves walking into the notorious Sednaya prison, known as the human slaughterhouse, and releasing the survivors they found inside. Some of those survivors had been in solitary confinement for a decade, not knowing who was still alive, not knowing the world had not forgotten them. The images broke hearts around the world. What comes next? 2025. Syria stands today at a crossroads that is all too familiar. The new rulers face impossible challenges: building a government from scratch, reconstructing cities that have been bombed into rubble, convincing millions of refugees to return, managing the competing interests of Turkey, Iran, Russia, the United States, Israel, and a dozen other powers that have used Syria as a chessboard for their own agendas. Syria is not unified. The Kurds control the northeast and want autonomy. Tribal leaders in the south have their own agendas. The Druze and Alawite communities fear reprisals. And the reconstruction, even if peace holds, will cost hundreds of billions of dollars that Syria does not have, and the world has been slow to offer. But here is what history tells us about Syria. This land has been conquered by Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans, French, and for a terrible decade, by its own government. Every time the Syrian people have survived, they carried their alphabet across the Mediterranean to become the letters we use today. They built cities that became the centers of world civilization. They preserved the knowledge of the ancient world. They gave humanity three of its greatest religions, or the sacred spaces where those religions crystallized. Syria is not a failed state. Syria is one of the oldest, deepest, most resilient human places on earth. A civilization that has survived everything history has thrown at it. Whether it can survive what the 21st century has thrown at it, we are still finding out. But in the streets of Damascus, for the first time in half a century, Syrians were walking without fear. That is, perhaps, where every story should begin. If this video gave you a new understanding of Syria, of why it matters, what it has endured, and what it means, please share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories of civilizations, empires, and the endlessly complicated human experiment of building a world. And if there's a country or civilization you want us to cover next, leave it in the comments. We'll see you in the next chapter of history.